Right, boys and girls, thank you for joining me once again where people continue to be wrong on the interwebs. It doesn't look like slowing down anytime soon. Let's deal with Dr. Boz, MD, who's not only wrong, but just incredibly ignorant. I have seen wrong before. I have seen ignorant before. I have seen incredible levels of wrong and ignorant before. And this is another example of incredible wrongness and incredible ignorance. All right, Boz, tell us all about the diabetes and metformin, though, and we'll put you right where you're wrong. And spoiler, boys and girls, that's just about everywhere. Let's go. Anytime you're ready, love. Yeah.
Hello, I am Dr. Bozworth, and we are trying this again. I have a patient who has been diagnosed with diabetes.
Right, okay. I presume you mean type 2.
Her A1C is 8.2 with an average blood sugar of 190.
Right, so step 1, stop pouring carbohydrates down your neck, that patient. That will help you to normalize your blood glucose levels. Type 2 diabetes is elevated blood glucose. That's all it is. That is how it is diagnosed. That is what the treatments, such that they are, that are available, attempt to ameliorate. That is both the symptomology and the actual disease process in and of itself. Elevated blood glucose is the problem. So, step 1, stop adding glucose to your blood. Okay? Good. What's next?
And her doctor actually prescribed metformin.
Ooh, goodness me. Bad idea.
And another medication. She did some research and said, I don't want to take that metformin. I want this problem fixed permanently.
Good, we'll stop pouring carbohydrates down your neck. Job's a good one. Solved. What's next?
Without using that medication.
Mm-hmm.
I have some insight as to what...
I don't think you do, Dr. Boz. I've listened to about the first 2/3 of this short video of yours, and it's clear and patent to me that you have no idea at all what you're talking about. None. But we'll cover that point-wise. Let's do that.
That was such a good idea. This is a example of a cell. This is a muscle cell.
M-U-S-E-L, a muscle. Good.
And this is the patient's bloodstream. In Mariah, and in anybody who is trying to use the fuel of glucose, there is a very important step that begins with the glucose coming in contact with this blue thing, which is a receptor. Think of it as a way to lift the glucose from the blood to the cell. In order for that to happen, Mr. Insulin needs to come along.
That's part of the story, Dr. Boz. It's not the full story remotely, because the conditions on the other side of the membrane, inside the cell, in the cell's cytosol, have to be such that that cell requires that substrate for use to produce energy, that glucose. Should that cell not require that energy, not require that substrate, not require that glucose, no amount of insulin is likely to push against that turning down of the mechanism from the inside. The thing that you will refer to quite erroneously, actually, as insulin resistance. It's nothing of the sort. The cell itself is replete with energy, probably in the form of fat or a mixture of fat and carbohydrate. In that situation, the problem is this, boys and girls. Glucose is damaging at high concentrations to tissues, to proteins, to all sorts of things. The complex, important cells of your body, for example, muscle cells, do not want a level of sugar in the cytosol of that cell that is high enough to cause that glycative derangement and damage to those cell structures, organelles, lipid rafts, DNA, etc. As such, Boys and girls, those cells will thereby, I usually parsimoniously refer to it as lock the doors from the inside to prevent that sugar from entering that cell and doing that damage. It's not a hard lock. This is a fader situation or a dial situation, if you like, whereby the sensitivity turns down in order precisely to prevent the cell from being damaged. It's a self-protective mechanism. It's part of a series of events which are caused or brought about by the activities of the Randall cycle, which is something that you should probably go and learn something about, Dr. Bozworth, because it's clear and patent that you don't know anything about that at this stage whatsoever, in fact. And as such, your education is destitute in this facet of human physiology and health, and you need to bring that up to speed, I'm afraid to say. Okay, so the sacrificial lambs become the red blood cells. That's what an A1C test is about. How poor has our blood sugar control been over the last 28 days or so, 90 days or so, depending on the form of A1C test that's being done. There you go. No problem, because you can replace your red blood cells much more rapidly, much more easily than a muscle cell. And as we evolved as a species, there was very few occasions where there was much of an insult to our systems possible through carbohydrate, because it wasn't available to us in the way that it currently is in modern society. So as such, that's the obvious way that the evolution has taken us, and it works perfectly. Okay? The answer is still the same. It's stop pouring carbohydrates down your neck. Stop doing that today. Well, I say that, but actually you should change your diet slowly, ramp-wise, over about 6 weeks to a diet free of carbohydrates. Don't change your diet overnight, actually. Bad idea. That's for another day. Right, Boz. What's next?
Along and give permission that it is the right thing to do. Taking that blood sugar and putting it into the cell.
Yeah, right. So you've got half the story there. Insulin does indeed stimulate the GLUT4 transporter to allow glucose into the cell, provided that cell needs that glucose and the internal compartment of that cell is not disallowing that, as it does do when the substrate provision in that cell is already replete. Or indeed, after a period of lockout, there is a lag time whereby the cells can drop below where they need to be in terms of energy provision, which can cause a whole bunch of other problems, which I might talk about later if it's important enough. Okay.
That's how the cell got fuel.
That's part of the way a cell gets fuel. Glucose is one available fuel source that cells indeed do oxidize for energy. There's another one. Have you ever heard of it, Bozzy Boz? It's called fat. It's the preferred, predominant, and evolutionary consistent form of substrate for energy provision in human cells. Okay?
When you look at Mariah's case, her blood sugar has been coming along and looking to get inside the cells in an excessive amount.
Right, that's for one of two or both simultaneously reasons. One, she's pouring carbohydrate down her neck every single day of her stupid life, despite the fact that she's a type 2 diabetic, which is totally contraindicated under any circumstances. And two, she's mixing carbohydrate with fat in her diet, which will activate the Randall cycle ever more powerfully and ever longer, with ever more delay on the release time afterwards, which will lead to chronic systemic inflammation and a continuation of her woes. She needs to stop doing those two things. And you can stop doing those two things by just stopping doing one thing, and that is the pouring of carbohydrates down her stupid neck. Stop it. Problem solved. Good.
The insulin has gone a little mad.
No, it hasn't. It's the same insulin. It's identical. There's just more of it there because more of it's been pumped there to attempt to force glucose out of the blood, despite the fact that the cells are, for want of a better term, locking that mechanism out and preventing it from happening. The body is attempting to maintain its homeostasis. It is a pathological situation, but the insulin is not mad. There's just too much of it.
In fact, her insulin is super high. She's very insulin resistant.
No, that's a construct, that's a concept, and it's an ignorant one. Because it fails to consider anything happening on the other side of the membrane, the very thing which actually is causing this effect. And that is that the cell is replete with energy, substrates, in the form of fats and or a mixture of fats and carbohydrates, most likely. Thus, it requires no further glucose, as it does not want the concentration of glucose to rise in that cell to a problematic level. Ergo, it disallows that from occurring. It's not insulin resistance. If you cleared the backlog of energy substrates already stored in that cell over time, and they filter through the oxidative system, that will unlock that door, and that cell will start to respond once again to that insulin. Perfectly, exactly the same way as it did beforehand. Nothing has changed. Insulin resistance. Don't be so ridiculous.
And what does that mean? It means that these glucoses, or this fuel, can't get inside that muscle cell.
For the reasons I've spoken about, because there's plenty of energy in that cell. There are plenty of substrates in that cell already.
Because insulin has been screaming at this receptor for so long that it's become resistant to listening to it.
No, it's resistant because of what's happening on the other side. That's the bit you're missing. That's the bit you don't understand. That is why you are incapable of giving the correct advice to this individual, which still is the same, and that is stop eating carbohydrates. Okay?
And that blood sugar is going to stay in the bloodstream for a really long time.
Well, for longer. Not for a really long time necessarily, because what will happen is as the concentration of glucose rises in the blood, then the de novo lipogenesis will kick in, along with the chronic systemic inflammation necessarily concomitant with that.
Fixing this problem in someone with an advanced problem in diabetes, where that blood sugar is, again, averaging at 190.
Yep.
Hemoglobin A1C is 8.2.
Yep.
This insulin has been doing this naughty little trick.
There's nothing naughty about what the insulin is doing. It's doing exactly what it should do according to the genetic design of the human being. It is not dysfunctional in any way. It is not in and of itself problematic in any way. Insulin being elevated is a symptom of elevated blood glucose. It is not the other way around. Okay?
A long period of time.
Longer.
And in fact, if we would look
Say in fact in front of something and it makes it true, even if it's not. Those are the rules.
inside the cells of Mariah, you would see that the fuel inside those muscle cells are low.
No. False. Absolute nonsense. Rubbish.
The cell is starving.
No. False. Nonsense. Rubbish.
It needs fuel.
Yes, in the form of fat or carbohydrate or a mixture up to a certain level. And it has that. That is why the cell GLUT4 transporter is hugely, vastly downregulated in its ability to respond to the insulin.
Her insulin is too high to produce ketones, so now it's got a double blocked entrance.
Yes, but there's still fat available for use. That's why those things are blocked out. Okay?
She can't make ketones because of the way her chemistry is, and the glucose can't get in.
Good thing there's still fat then, isn't there? That's why she's not dead.
So along comes metformin. And what does metformin do? Well, it performs a little magic trick.
No, it's nothing magic about it. It's just chemistry, love.
Metformin locally affects how this receptor will now...
Right, so now it forces that glucose out of the bloodstream into the cell, thus causing the exact damage that the cell was preventing by completely appropriately locking that door in the first place. You've now kicked that door open, you've forced that door open, and you're forcing that glucose to enter that cell according to its concentration gradient, which will destroy that cell much more rapidly. Good work, Boz. Awesome. What's next?
Listen to insulin. And you can think of it as a little micro pocket of making this receptor less insulin resistant.
No, it was still exactly as reactive to insulin as it always was. It was just being told via another messenger system on the inside of the cell, at this time, right now, at this instant, this cell is replete. We need no further glucose. Lock the door. Or indeed, the cell realizes fairly quickly, if there's a vast pooling of glucose in the blood very suddenly, like, oh, what happens every single time you pour carbohydrates down your neck, then it locks the door. Whoops, better protect ourselves from this. We can see a problem coming on here. Let's prevent it. Lock the door. Thank you very much. We'll wait for the blood glucose to drop via de novo lipogenesis, or via other cells which are not replete with energy, drawing that glucose down, for example. Okay? Goodness me.
It now allows that insulin to communicate with that receptor, and the glucose can flow into the cell.
And destroy it. Good.
So as much as Mariah really had the best of intentions for taking care of her diabetes.
And she was right and you are wrong, though, Bozzy Boz. She did some research and found out that it was an incredibly bad idea to take metformin, especially long term. While ever you failed utterly to tell her that the way to ameliorate the problem was to stop pouring carbohydrates down her neck. The actual thing that would work. Good work. First do no harm, they say. Lovely.
Diabetes naturally. Wanting to improve her diet, lower that blood sugar by changing the way she eats, I fully support that.
Right. Did you tell her to do that? Because that would basically ameliorate the requirement for, or the proposed requirement for metformin. Wouldn't it?
She should do that. But in the meantime, she has cells, not only in her muscle, but in her brain and in her body that are starving for fuel.
No, they are not. False. Utter nonsense.
That causes a rapid deterioration and a rapid aging in.
Not as rapidly as glycating the cells by ramming in glucose that has no business being there, against the genetic design of the human being that is responding physiologically in an entirely appropriate fashion to what is an entirely unnatural situation, the consumption of vast quantities of carbohydrates multiple times a day, every single stupid day of your life. Wow, this is incredible, isn't it, kids?
Inside her system. So in the setting of whether or not I would recommend she takes that metformin, I say yes.
Right, well, you need to be struck off the medical register until you can learn about basic human physiology, metabolic pathways, human health, and nutritional requirements for human beings. Boz. Dangerous, contraindicated, misanthropic information from you there. Under no circumstances should that individual take metformin. Goodness gracious.
Metformin cannot lower her blood sugar too much, like several other of the options out there for diabetes, and it fixes the little spot of insulin resistance that insulin
resistance is a construct which you clearly do not understand, even at its most basic tenets, Boz. And you're not fixing anything with metformin. You are subterfuging, bypassing the design of the human body in a dangerous and contraindicated fashion. And you need to be struck off the medical register. You need to be disbarred from medical practice permanently because of your disgraceful misinformation here. Just my opinion, doesn't have to be anybody else's, but there you go.
Insulin resistance that we need to fix most.
No, we don't. We do not need to fix that. It was working perfectly in the first place. It was doing exactly what it should do.
Which is?
The problem is too much carbohydrate. Not enough insulin sensitivity was not the problem. Too much carbohydrate was the problem. Solution, stop adding carbohydrate exogenously to the body. Still, no drugs involved or required. No dangerous, contraindicated, stupid interventions like the one you're talking about here, boss. Seriously, Annette, what are you doing? This is disgraceful.
Get that receptor to lift those glucoses, put them out of the bloodstream.
Why would you want to do that? They are being locked and held in the bloodstream precisely because they are not needed in the cell, and thus to encourage the de novo lipogenic system to clear them that way. What is wrong with you?
And into the cells and improve the nutrition, the fuel that's happening inside.
Right, by removing carbohydrates from that mix, because they're not required. Not 1 gram ever of exogenous carbohydrate is required in the human diet, ever. Problem solved. Goodness gracious me.
Those blood cells. This is just a pocket education. I hope.
Miseducation, misanthropic disinformation, bought and paid for by Big Pharma. I hope they send you a nice big check, Annette. Hope you enjoy that money while people continue to die as a result of type 2 diabetes that metformin will not solve. Ever. Anyway, Bozzy is summing up, so we're done. Join me next time when someone else will be wrong on interwebs and disingenuous and misanthropic and dangerous in their contraindicated misinformation. Join me for that. In the meantime, enjoy the strains of Vivaldi 2, 3, 4.